Welcome to your lecture on trait perspective. As we talk about personality theory, you're going to find that different perspectives come at the information from obviously different ways. With Freud, he talked about personality coming from your unconscious storehouse. With trait theory, we're going to be talking about the biological underpinnings of personality. In other words, how your personality might be really written into your DNA. The theory that was written by William Herbert Sheldon back in the 1940s had to do with your body type. Please understand that this is a wildly outdated theory, and you can have any body type and very different personalities. He came up with these three: the endomorph, the mesomorph, and the ectomorph. And we don't really use them today. You will see these presented on all sorts of dieting commercial type things on the internet. They're just not real. If you've ever asked somebody about their personality, what you're asking them is, what are your personality traits? What are the aspects that make up their personalities, these patterns of behaviors? It's a disposition to feel or act. And usually we figure out what our traits are by taking a inventory, a personality inventory, which is usually self-report, a questionnaire with true or false or agree to disagree items like 1 to 5 measured by what we'd call a Likert scale. People respond to these, and we use them to figure out what their personality traits are. Gordon Allport has a theory about traits, and he said essentially we have 3 types of traits, and that these are essentially these stable personality characteristics that we use to guide our thoughts, actions, in all sorts of different conditions. The first one he said are our essential traits, and think of these as literally to the center or the core of your personality. You might sit there and say that person in almost every situation is generally a happy person, or maybe they're moody. Secondary traits have to do with preferences and attitudes. So someone who may have a central trait characteristic of being happy may prefer to be around outgoing people or have a more optimistic attitude towards life. When we get to cardinal traits, Allport said that these are really kind of defining personal traits, and not everybody has a cardinal trait, and sometimes they just get developed later in life. You can see cardinal traits when we look at characters on television, or maybe even from, TV or, stories. So if you've ever watched The Simpsons and you look at Montgomery Burns, his cardinal trait, he's known for being greedy. The Grinch, for being kind of mean and greedy. But when we say something like that, almost that person becomes synonymous with their personality trait. So when we talk about this, few people are going to have these really truly defining traits. Mother Teresa, you may sit there and say that her defining personality trait or her cardinal trait was generosity or a giving, personality. Those would be defining. While I'd love to show you this video, unless we're in class together, you don't get to see it. The Barnum effect, think of P.T. Barnum. The Barnum effect is that if we were to list as many possible personality traits out there and write it in such a way that you could see yourself, you would believe that you fit anything. So we'll see this when we look at horoscopes. Write a horoscope in a right way, and everybody sees that horoscope come true in their lives. With personality theory, be careful. Really, you can write any personality trait in such a way that you feel like it talks about you. That means that when we actually test for personality traits, we have to find ways to really hone in and focus on very specific traits and understand whether or not we are measuring truly what we're looking for. One of the personality tests or type indicators is the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Many of you have probably taken this because you know that you are an ENTJ or some other kind of 4-letter acronym. Often English classes will have you take it, and they may have actually had you take it at Human Metrics. Human Metrics is not the actual Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. It's just a available version of it that gives you kind of a general idea of where you might fall. To really take the Myers-Briggs, you would actually have to take it with a psychologist. The Myers-Briggs was actually created by 2 fans of Jungian psychology, and they wanted to construct a test that would help women find job placement post-World War II. When we look at the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, it'll put you into 4 different categories and kind of puts you on 2 different spectrums. It's interesting because you can read a lot of these and find yourself in a variety of different categories. But usually it's pretty consistent, and again, as long as you're being as honest as possible, you should get a pretty honest rating back. Factor analysis was looked at before when we talked about intelligence testing. Well, obviously, if we're talking about traits or different breakdowns of personality, we're talking about different factors again. And so when we talk about factor analysis, we're going to see this cluster in our personality traits. Hans and Sybil Eisenach suggested that personality could be reduced down to 2 really kind of polar dimensions. How outgoing your personality is, or how reserved, so extroversion and introversion, and how stable or healthy the personality traits are, or the reverse, how unstable or unhealthy the personality traits were. And it looks essentially like this. 4 different factors, and within all those factors, a variety of different personality traits. So if you are extroverted and stable, you might be a leader or responsive or maybe even talkative. And as you get closer to kind of the mid-range, you start to see that they might change a little bit. Unstable might be excitable or touchy. Flip to the other side, and introverted, more internal. If they were stable, you might be calm, even-tempered, controlled. And you slip over into the more unstable, anxious, rigid, somber, maybe even pessimistic. They looked at this as 2 axes for describing personality variations. But again, we might sit there and say that maybe we have more than just stable, unstable, introverted, and extroverted. The Big 5 traits is the most recognized and accepted theory of personality currently today. And it goes off of the 5-factor model of personality traits. Easiest way to remember this is remember either canoe or ocean. That's a really nice acronym that keeps all of them together. In this theory, it looks at 5 major traits: neuroticism, extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. Each one of these is a spectrum that you can range from low to high. So, are you highly neurotic? Are you always worried? Or are you usually generally pretty calm and easygoing, low neurotic? Are you highly extroverted? So, very sociable and kind of outgoing, or are you low on the extroversion? You are a bit more retiring or a bit more kind of self-isolating. Are you open to experience or closed off to experience? Are you heavily agreeable or are you very disagreeable? Are you very conscientious, meaning aware of time and due dates and what's going on around you, or are you kind of a scatterbrain? What we see with the Big 5 is that this represents in pretty much every society and civilization on the planet, save a very few small societies that are in the Amazon and are completely cut off from the rest of modern society. Here are all 5 of the different personality factors for the Big 5 theory. And again, as you can see, you can have high and low, different endpoints of these dimensions. If you take something like conscientiousness, are you very organized or disorganized? Careful or careless, disciplined or impulsive? Where you fall on each one of these kind of sets where you are in that trait dimension. These are actually very stable traits, and they tend to be fairly consistent throughout your lifetime, but they can change over development. In any given population, you're going to see roughly 50% or so for each trait. So we see them in populations. They're common across cultures, and they can be somewhat predictive. People who are conscientious are usually more get up in the morning and get going types. People who are extroverted tend to be more active at night. There have been correlations found with the Big 5. High GPAs in high school and college are often with high conscientiousness. And if you think about it, people who plan and are aware of due dates and times probably do well in school. Conscientiousness and extroversion are predictors of occupational attainment. Again, having that kind of knowledge of due dates and how other people work, plus being someone who likes to be around people or at least emotionally outgoing in that environment, works. Now, depending on what you look at, you may be extroverted in one test and introverted in another. So while I'm truly an introvert, when it comes to the Big 5, I tend to score fairly high on extroversion. So I do work well with others. I can be outgoing, but in a more Jungian sense, I find it mentally exhausting as well. Neuroticism elevates the probability of divorce. So if you're a worrywart or someone who is constantly nitpicky, well, you might not be the greatest person to be married to. The five-factor theory is the dominant concept in personality structure in contemporary psychology. So while we'll talk about humanistic, we'll talk about sociocultural, we'll talk about the Freudian psychoanalytic, the big five, that's kind of our go-to one today. Some people feel that this is still a bit too arbitrary. Others feel that there's more than 5 traits. And others have argued that there are some important traits that just don't fit the model as it is. While there are the 5-trait theory, Raymond Cattell came up with the 16 personality factor theory. And this theory says that there are 16 personality factors that are essentially the building blocks to your personality. Now, you don't need to know the 16 factors, but you should know the difference between what he considered a surface trait and a source trait. The surface traits, they make up the visible areas of personality, while the source traits are kind of more the underlying. In other words, the ones that we can see are on the surface, but the ones that are kind of more of our core personality, well, those are our source. We all have the same basic traits, but just like the big five, we have different degrees to which we express these traits. As we look at any of these theories, we do agree with trait theory that there is some biology involved. There are some genetic predispositions that influence personality traits. So when we look at temperament and behavioral style, well, we know that we often get that from our DNA. In fact, temperament is very DNA based. Twin studies and adoption studies also point to the fact that personality forms under the influence of genes, meaning that you can find a child adopted in another family who has a very similar personality to their biological parents, as opposed to more like their adoptive parents. And we look at things like shyness. Well, shyness isn't the same as introversion. Shyness is what you would see in a child with a really high autonomic nervous system reactivity response. In other words, they go into fight or flight really easy. So while I'm an introvert, I'm not shy. The Eisniks also have a theory that look at 3 higher order traits: extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. Higher order traits lead to lower order traits and then to habitual responses and personality responses. Essentially, what they believed was it kind of worked like a flow chart. And personality for them is linked deeply into genetics. Eisnik looked at personality structure like a hierarchy. So if we look at his trait of extroversion, he'd say that maybe that higher order trait leads to lower traits, like how social or, energized and lively you are. And then if you are a sociable person, your habitual responses, your kind of go-to responses are A or B. So I'm not highly sociable, so my habitual response is usually to make an excuse about why I can't go to something. And then we have our very specific responses. In other words, higher order traits come down into more specific traits. Those traits usually dictate the general responses that we give, and from those general responses, depending on the scenario, there's a specific response. Eisnik felt personality was largely determined, again, by genetics, and that people can be conditioned more readily than others. In fact, he felt that introverts were much easier to condition. They have higher levels of psychological arousal, making conditioning something that they actually are more likely to be impacted by. He also said that acquired conditioned inhibitions can lead to tentative social interactions. Well, what does that mean? If you have learned to feel restricted or inhibited when around others, your social interactions can be confused or maybe strained. When we look at assessing traits, we go back to those personality inventories, which I talked to you about when we looked at the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Again, usually questionnaires. The MMPI-2, or the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, is the one that is most widely used right now. It is held under lock and key by psychologists, but it is used because it's actually pretty good at identifying emotional disorders. It's used today. It's been renormed across a full cross-section of Americans, making it applicable to the population. It looks at 10 different clinical diagnosable scales, and it even has questions in there that are meant to check validity. In other words, to try to catch people in lies. So things like, I get angry sometimes, if you answer false to that, it's a lie. Everybody gets angry sometimes. It's scored objectively, so basically it's a Scantron test. computers can score it because there is criteria to it. It doesn't guarantee validity, and here's why. You know what is a socially desirable response, so you can lie and try to push the answers a certain way. But if you take it honestly, it's a pretty good way of measuring where you are. So here's an MMPI test profile. What you're looking at in the pink is the after treatment scores. In the blue, these would be scores that would leave that person maybe significantly needing treatment by a therapist or in a hospital. So before treatment, anxious, depressed, maybe displaying deviant behaviors. They get treatment. After the treatment, the scores have improved, showing that the treatment worked. Now, I took the MMPI-2 as a part of my background test to get into the police department. I actually had a little bit of an issue with claustrophobia, and it actually showed up on the test, which became a talking point during my background check. It's a pretty significant and good way of testing personality factors. It's also a really long test. It was roughly around 600 questions, and they ask similar questions on repeat just to see whether or not you are consistent in your answers. One of the big questions that has actually been present in personality psychology is, does a situation determine your personality, or is your personality always the same? The answer to that question, well, is yes. So this was first brought to the forefront by Walter Mischel in what was called the person-situation controversy. And Mischel said that traits aren't really good predictors of behavior because behavior changes due to situations. He was a big advocate for the social learning theory, which you might remember back from the Bobo doll experiment. When we talk about this, he says that the environment dictates the personality, that an honest person can be also a liar, or a person who is kind can be cruel. And what we found out when entire thing was kind of investigated was that situations can very much determine personality. But if you look at someone in kind of very broad strokes over a long continuum of time, there are certain personality traits that are more consistent than others. So, given no kind of extreme situations, our personalities are fairly consistent. However, given an extreme situation, the situation may dictate a different personality. Trait theorists argue that behaviors from a situation may be different, but on average, the behavior remains the same. And that really is what came out from the person-situation controversy. Traits matter. So as you get older, your traits become more consistent over time, less likely to change. But again, you could have that very honest and kind person become someone who is dishonest and cruel if put in a very unique situation. The consistency of expressive styles in speaking, gestures, all of these things demonstrate trait consistency. And it also demonstrates some genetic components. It is funny that people will see me with my brothers and realize that we have very similar cadences in our speech, very similar personality traits when it comes to senses of humor, that there are some consistencies. And we actually are pretty good at judging people in very short time periods. So observers are able to judge people's behaviors and feelings in as little as 30 seconds, and in some cases as little as 2, and be pretty dang correct. So if you meet someone and your first inclination is you don't really like them, that might actually be the way that it sticks. We're pretty good at judging behavior and personality within about 30 seconds.